In early 2025, the relationship between the United States and India entered one of its most turbulent phases in recent memory. Washington unveiled a sweeping package of tariffs, raising duties on most Indian imports to nearly 50%. Officials in the U.S. justified the move as a direct response to India's continued appetite for Russian crude oil, purchased at discounts that made a mockery of the Western sanctions regime. The announcement reverberated across global markets, signaling that America was willing to risk friction with a key partner in the Indo-Pacific in order to send a message about Russia's war economy. For Washington, the tariffs were about more than oil. They were also about optics and politics. The White House faced pressure to demonstrate that sanctions against Moscow still had teeth. American voters, feeling the sting of inflation and worried about industrial decline, wanted to see toughness not only against adversaries but also against partners perceived as taking advantage of the rules. India, importing massive volumes of discounted crude and refining it into products for export, looked to some U.S. lawmakers like a country profiting from Western sacrifice. In speeches and press briefings, U.S. officials insisted that sanction busting by friendly nations could not be tolerated, and India was held up as a test case. In New Delhi, the mood was defiant. Indian officials, from cabinet ministers to trade envoys, dismissed the tariffs as heavy-handed and unfair. They argued that India's purchases of Russian oil had prevented a far greater global crisis. Without Indian demand, they claimed, crude prices might have skyrocketed above $200 per barrel, shattering fragile economies across the global south. The narrative in India was clear. Buying discounted oil was not betrayal, but pragmatism, and in a world where energy security meant economic survival, New Delhi would not bow to American pressure. The government projected calm determination, presenting the tariffs as an opportunity to double down on Make in India initiatives, accelerate diversification of export markets, and strengthen ties with other partners. The economic stakes were high on both sides. For India, the U.S. is one of its largest trading partners, particularly in technology and services. Tariffs on goods were not catastrophic, but they threatened to spill over into broader areas of cooperation. American companies rely on Indian IT firms, and Indian exporters value access to the American consumer market. The specter of retaliatory tariffs loomed in the air, and business groups on both sides urged restraint. Yet politically, neither government wanted to appear weak. For Washington, the decision was also a gamble. While tariffs were meant to demonstrate resolve, they risked alienating a partner central to America's Indo-Pacific strategy. In military exercises, in diplomatic forums like the Quad, and in global supply chains, India has become indispensable to counterbalancing China's growing clout. By escalating an economic confrontation, the U.S. signaled that its sanctions policy trumped strategic patience, at least in the short term. Analysts warned that this might play into the hands of Beijing and Moscow, both eager to exploit cracks in U.S.-India cooperation. Behind the scenes, diplomats tried to manage the fallout. Quiet talks explored carve-outs, phased relief, or exemptions tied to compliance with the oil price cap. But Indian officials insisted that sovereignty came first. The message was that India could not and would not subordinate its energy policy to Western political timelines. Buying Russian crude was framed as a sovereign choice, grounded in national interest, not an act of defiance against the West. The tariffs also highlighted the deeper philosophical divide between Washington and New Delhi. The U.S. prefers to think in terms of alliances and obligations, expecting partners to align on sanctions and security. India, by contrast, champions what it calls strategic autonomy, a policy that allows it to engage with multiple powers without becoming anyone's junior partner. To Indian policymakers, the tariffs reinforced an uncomfortable truth. America's expectations of loyalty often clash with India's insistence on independence. The public reaction reflected this divide. In the U.S., media coverage emphasized sanctions evasion, portraying India as an opportunist undermining the fight against Russia. In India, headlines painted a different story, casting the tariffs as unfair punishment for a country that had acted responsibly to stabilize global energy prices. Editorials celebrated India's resilience and portrayed the U.S. as hypocritical, willing to sacrifice partners when domestic politics demanded it. For ordinary businesses, the consequences were immediate. Exporters in India faced shrinking margins, while American importers scrambled to find alternatives or absorb costs. Analysts predicted that some sectors, textiles, chemicals, and steel, would bear the brunt. Yet others suggested the tariffs could accelerate shifts already underway. India looking to diversify trade toward Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, and the U.S. exploring reshoring and friend-shoring options. In the geopolitical arena, the tariffs injected new uncertainty. Would they weaken the Quad, already fragile after years of cautious coordination? Would they embolden China, which could present itself as a more reliable partner to India in certain domains? Or would they force both Washington and New Delhi to eventually find compromise, recognizing that neither side could afford a permanent rift? These questions hovered as analysts debated the longer-term impact. By the end of 2025's first quarter, one thing was clear: the tariff shock had redefined the U.S.-India relationship. No longer was it a straightforward partnership framed by shared democratic values and mutual concern about China. Instead, it became a more complicated dance of cooperation and conflict, of public tension and private negotiation. For Washington, the tariffs were a statement that even friends could face penalties for undermining sanctions. For New Delhi, they were a reminder that autonomy comes at a cost, but also an opportunity to showcase resilience and chart a path less dependent on American goodwill. The tariff war was only the first chapter in a larger story of shifting global alignments. Russia's discounted oil, China's shadow over the Himalayas, and the fragile balance of Indo-Pacific strategy all loomed in the background. But in that moment, the central image was stark: two great democracies, linked by trade and security, staring each other down over barrels of oil and billions in duties, each unwilling to blink. First, in the years following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, few relationships in the global energy market shifted as dramatically as the one between Moscow and New Delhi. Before the war, India bought relatively little Russian crude, sourcing most of its supply from the Middle East. But by 2023, and especially through 2024 and 2025, Russia had vaulted into the position of India's top oil supplier. The transformation was so rapid and so dramatic that analysts described it as a marriage of necessity. Russia, shut out of Europe by sanctions and embargoes, needed buyers. India, hungry for cheap energy to fuel its fast-growing economy, needed affordable oil. The result was a partnership that altered the balance of global trade. Russian oil flowed eastward on an unprecedented scale. Tankers left ports on the Baltic and Black Seas, often reflagged or disguised by ship-to-ship transfers, and made their way to refineries on India's western coast. The shipments were not only consistent, they were priced at discounts, sometimes exceeding $20-30 per barrel below global benchmarks. For a country that imports more than 80% of its crude needs, these savings were transformative. India's government calculated that buying Russian barrels had saved billions of dollars in foreign exchange reserves, stabilized domestic fuel prices, and prevented the kind of energy shock that could have derailed its economic recovery after the pandemic. Indian officials framed the policy as not only pragmatic, but also beneficial to the world. Energy Minister Hardeep Singh Puri publicly argued that without India's willingness to soak up Russian supplies, the global oil market might have spiraled out of control. He suggested that crude prices could have surged toward $200 per barrel, a level that would have crippled developing nations and perhaps even pushed parts of the West into recession. By this logic, India's purchases were not acts of defiance but acts of responsibility, helping to cushion the blow of war-induced disruptions. But in Washington, London, and Brussels, the story was seen very differently. To Western policymakers, every tanker heading to India was another crack in the wall of sanctions. The U.S. and its allies had imposed a price cap of $60 per barrel on Russian crude, designed to limit Moscow's revenues while keeping oil flowing. The system depended on shipping services, insurers, and banks industries largely dominated by the West, enforcing compliance. But as India, along with China, emerged as a major buyer, enforcement became nearly impossible. A new shadow fleet of older tankers, often uninsured or covered through opaque arrangements, carried the oil. Traders routed sales through Dubai or Singapore, adding layers of complexity to obscure the true cost. American analysts warned that the discounts India paid were still high enough to give Moscow steady revenue, financing its war machine. Russia's budget, though strained, continued to rely heavily on oil and gas exports. Each month of sustained sales to India blunted the intended impact of sanctions, turning one of the world's largest democracies into an unintended lifeline for Vladimir Putin. The arrangement also raised uncomfortable questions about values and interests. The United States had long hoped to frame its partnership with India as one based on shared democratic ideals and a common front against authoritarianism. But India's reliance on Russian energy highlighted a more transactional side of its foreign policy. Strategic autonomy meant freedom to choose partners based on national need, not on ideology. And in the realm of energy, Russia offered what the West could not: large volumes of affordable crude with few political strings attached. Inside India, the reliance on Russian oil carried both benefits and risks. Economically, the savings were undeniable. Politically, the optics were more complex. India has historically balanced its ties between Moscow and Washington, but the deepening energy trade risked entrenching a dependency on a Russia that was increasingly isolated from the West and locked in a closer embrace with China. Some Indian strategists worried that while cheap oil was convenient now, it might limit New Delhi's room for maneuver later, especially if Russia expected political loyalty in return. For Washington, the frustration grew as the numbers rose. Reports from shipping trackers in late 2024 showed Indian imports of Russian oil hitting new highs, even as the U.S. prepared new tariff measures. The Biden administration had hoped that pressure, both diplomatic and financial, would push New Delhi to scale back. Instead, the opposite happened. Indian refiners increased their purchases, often reselling refined products like diesel and jet fuel to Europe and other markets, essentially flipping Russian crude back into the Western economy. To U.S. lawmakers, this was not just sanctions evasion, it was profiteering. Yet even in America, not everyone agreed on how to handle the problem. Some energy experts acknowledged that without Indian and Chinese demand, Russian oil might have vanished from the market altogether, triggering the very price spike that India warned about. Others pointed out that enforcing the price cap globally was never realistic. In this view, India's role was not undermining sanctions, but exposing their limits. On the streets of India, meanwhile, the debate felt distant. What mattered to most citizens was that petrol prices remained relatively stable despite global turbulence. Stable energy costs meant more predictable inflation, more affordable transportation, and more resilience for industries from agriculture to manufacturing. For a government seeking to maintain high growth rates and keep its massive population economically secure, cheap Russian oil was more than a bargain. it was a political necessity. The partnership also underscored Russia's enduring soft power in India. Decades of defense ties, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic support at the United Nations gave Moscow a reservoir of goodwill that cushioned the criticism. Indian media often framed Western anger as hypocrisy, pointing out that European nations had themselves imported Russian energy well into 2022 and 2023 before gradually tapering off. Why, commentators asked, should India bear the cost of Western sanctions for a war it did not start? As 2025 unfolded, the arrangement showed no sign of slowing. Analysts projected that Russian crude would remain a fixture of India's energy mix for the foreseeable future, even if discounts narrowed. The sheer scale of India's demand, coupled with Russia's need for buyers, created a symbiosis that neither side could easily abandon. The United States, despite tariffs and pressure, seemed unable to break the bond. This chapter of the U.S. India relationship revealed an uncomfortable truth. Values matter, but energy matters more. As long as oil remains the world's most strategic commodity, nations will prioritize secure and affordable supplies over ideological alignment. For India, that meant turning to Russia. For the U.S., it meant facing the limits of its sanctions strategy. The lifeline of Russian oil was not just about barrels and dollars. It was about the hard realities of a multipolar world where even close partners chart their own course when survival is on the line. In late 2023, a story broke in Washington that rattled the U.S. India relationship in ways few had anticipated. Federal prosecutors revealed that they had foiled a murder for hire plot on American soil. The intended target was Gurpatwant Singh Pannan, a Sikh separatist leader and lawyer who has long campaigned for a referendum on Khalistan, an independent Sikh homeland carved out of India's Punjab state. For years, Pannan had been a polarizing figure, dismissed in India as a fringe agitator, but protected in the U.S. Under the banner of free speech, the Department of Justice alleged that the plot traced back to an Indian national working with a former Indian intelligence officer. According to court filings, the plan involved hiring a hitman, who turned out to be an undercover informant, to assassinate Pannan in New York. The details were chilling: down payments, surveillance, coded conversations, and an urgency that suggested the order had high-level backing. For Washington, the case crossed a red line. The U.S. has tolerated, to varying degrees, political friction with partners over diaspora politics, but the idea of a foreign government orchestrating a targeted killing inside America was different. It cut to the core of sovereignty, security, and trust. Officials described it in stark terms: a violation not only of American law, but of the foundational principles underpinning any partnership. In New Delhi, the response was cautious at first, then defensive. India's government denied any official role, stressing that it respected the sovereignty of other nations. Privately, officials expressed frustration that Washington was giving a platform to separatists like Pannan, who, from India's perspective, incited violence and threatened its territorial integrity. Yet even as the government distanced itself, pressure mounted for accountability. The fallout was immediate. Diplomatic meetings grew tense. Congressional voices in the U.S. called for stronger scrutiny of India, questioning whether a partner touted as a pillar of democracy was playing by the rules. For Indian officials, the allegations threatened to overshadow years of carefully nurtured goodwill, from defense deals to joint military exercises. Trust, once shaken, proved hard to restore. The case unfolded in parallel with a similar controversy in Canada, where the killing of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in June 2023 sparked accusations of Indian involvement. In both countries, the diaspora politics of Khalistan collided with New Delhi's determination to quash separatism. For India, the Khalistan movement represented not free expression, but a painful echo of violence from the 1980s and 1990s. For the West, however, Indian methods raised alarms about extraterritorial overreach. In early 2024, the U.S. indictment laid out the alleged chain of command. A man named Nikhil Gupta, described as the intermediary, was arrested in the Czech Republic and later extradited to the United States. Prosecutors accused him of coordinating with an unnamed Indian intelligence official. The evidence included encrypted messages and recorded conversations in which the conspirators discussed the logistics of the assassination. The narrative painted a troubling picture, a shadowy intersection of espionage, criminal networks, and state interests. For New Delhi, the priority became damage control. The government announced the formation of a high-level inquiry committee to investigate the allegations. Indian diplomats stressed that if individuals had acted outside the law, they would be held accountable. But at home, political leaders also struck a nationalist tone, refusing to concede that the state itself bore responsibility. Commentators warned against allowing foreign governments to dictate terms or tarnish India's image. By mid-2025, the committee submitted its findings. Reports indicated that at least one individual tied to Indian intelligence would face legal consequences. U.S. officials cautiously welcomed the move, describing it as a step toward accountability and reform. Yet the damage lingered. The plot had introduced a note of mistrust that tariffs and oil disputes alone could not explain. It suggested that beneath the rhetoric of partnership, there were areas where Washington and New Delhi saw the world, and the rules, very differently. The broader implications were profound. The U.S. has long championed India as a fellow democracy and a counterweight to China. But the Panun case forced uncomfortable questions. Could the world's largest democracy resort to the tactics of authoritarian regimes? Could Washington trust intelligence sharing with a partner accused of planning covert operations on its soil? For India, the lesson was equally sobering. It discovered that diaspora politics in North America, once a peripheral issue, could escalate into a central fault line in bilateral relations. Among the Indian diaspora, the case deepened divides. Sikh activists in the U.S. and Canada seized on the revelations to argue that India was suppressing dissent far beyond its borders. For many Indian Americans, the accusations felt like a stain on the image of a rising India they were proud to represent. On social media, debates flared between those defending India's right to protect its unity and those condemning any extrajudicial tactics. In the geopolitical theater, adversaries were quick to exploit the rift. Chinese state media highlighted the case as proof that U.S. partnerships were fragile and hypocritical. Russian analysts quietly pointed out that Washington seemed willing to alienate India, giving Moscow more space to preserve its historic ties with New Delhi. For both Beijing and Moscow, the spectacle of two major democracies clashing over espionage and assassination narratives served their interests. Yet despite the bruises, the relationship did not collapse. Both Washington and New Delhi understood that their strategic convergence on trade, technology, and the Indo-Pacific balance was too important to abandon. The Panun case, like the tariff war, became part of a larger pattern, moments of confrontation layered atop a partnership of necessity. What emerged was a relationship less idealized, more transactional, and more candid about its limits. The story of the assassination plot illustrated a paradox. On the one hand, it exposed deep mistrust, legal battles, and clashing narratives of democracy and sovereignty. On the other, it demonstrated that even serious disputes could be managed when both sides recognized the costs of rupture. In that sense, the Panun fallout became not just a crisis, but also a test of whether the U.S. and India could sustain a partnership despite profound differences. As the inquiry wound down and prepared to stand trial in an American courtroom, the questions remained unresolved. Would the accountability measures in India satisfy Washington? Would New Delhi change its approach to diaspora politics abroad? Or would this be just the first of many such incidents in an age where domestic politics, diaspora activism, and great power rivalry intersected in dangerous ways? For now, the image endures, an activist under U.S. protection, a plot foiled by law enforcement, and two governments navigating the stormy waters of accountability. The Panun case may one day fade into the background of history, but its shadow will linger as a reminder that even the closest of partners can clash when sovereignty, security, and identity collide. When Prime Minister Narendra Modi landed in Moscow in July 2024, the world was watching closely. The timing was almost cinematic. Just hours earlier, a missile strike had ripped through Kiev, shattering the walls of a children's hospital and killing young patients. Images of injured children flashed across global news channels. And then came the pictures from Moscow, Modi smiling, embracing Vladimir Putin, and receiving the ceremonial welcome of a trusted partner. The optics were striking. On one side of Europe, grief and outrage; on the other, symbolism of warmth and continuity. For critics, the contrast was damning. For supporters, it was proof of India's willingness to chart its own course, regardless of Western opinion. The visit embodied the paradox at the heart of India's relationship with Russia, a partnership rooted in history and necessity, but increasingly difficult to justify in the court of global opinion. India's ties to Russia are not a recent convenience. They stretch back to the Cold War, when the Soviet Union became India's most reliable ally. Moscow supplied New Delhi with weapons, vetoes at the UN Security Council, and diplomatic support during its wars with Pakistan. Even after the Soviet collapse, the legacy endured. By the 2000s, an estimated 60–70% of India's military hardware was of Russian origin. Fighter jets, tanks, submarines, even aircraft carriers. Much of the backbone of India's defense capability bore the Russian stamp. This dependency created a bond not easily broken, especially when China, India's chief rival, enjoyed deep defense ties with Russia as well. Energy deepened the relationship. Russia's vast reserves of oil and natural gas, combined with its willingness to sell at favorable terms, offered India a secure supply. When Western sanctions began squeezing Moscow in 2022, India stepped in to buy crude at steep discounts, a move that not only fueled its own growth, but also gave Russia a crucial lifeline. By 2024, Russia had overtaken Iraq and Saudi Arabia as India's largest oil supplier. The Moscow visit showcased both the strength and the strain of this relationship. On the one hand, Modi's presence signaled continuity. He was reaffirming that, despite pressure from Washington and Brussels, India would not sever ties with a country that had been a friend for decades. Defense deals, joint projects, and energy flows would continue. On the other hand, Modi's carefully chosen words hinted at unease. In a rare moment of candor, he told Putin directly that the death of innocent children in Ukraine was painful and terrifying. It was a rebuke cloaked in diplomatic language, a subtle attempt to balance empathy with realpolitik. Western analysts debated the meaning of these gestures. Some saw the criticism as symbolic, a way for India to deflect accusations of complicity without altering its fundamental stance. Others argued it marked the beginning of a shift, with New Delhi signaling that while it would not abandon Moscow, neither would it blindly endorse its actions. This middle ground, condemning the human cost while preserving strategic ties, became the hallmark of India's balancing act. The risks of this strategy were clear. By leaning too close to Moscow, India risked alienating the United States, whose technology, investment, and diplomatic support were crucial for New Delhi's rise as a global power. By leaning too close to Washington, India risked antagonizing Russia, losing access to weapons and energy at a time when alternatives were not fully in place. Strategic autonomy demanded that India walk the tightrope, never leaning too far in either direction. This balancing act extended beyond energy and defense. In multilateral forums, India often played mediator. At the G20, it positioned itself as the voice of the global South, refusing to take sides while advocating dialogue. Modi's famous remark to Putin in 2022, "Today's era is not of war," was replayed often as evidence of India's moral posture. Yet behind the slogans lay a pragmatic calculation. India needed Russia too much to sever ties, but it needed the West too much to fully embrace Moscow. The defense dimension complicated things further. As Russia's war dragged on, its ability to deliver spare parts and fulfill contracts came under strain. Indian military planners began accelerating diversification, turning to France for fighter jets, the U.S. for drones and surveillance systems, and Israel for missile defense, but unwinding decades of dependence is slow. For at least another decade, Russian hardware will remain embedded in India's arsenal. That reality limits how far New Delhi can pivot away from Moscow without risking gaps in readiness. Energy told a similar story. Russian oil provided stability and savings, but over-reliance carried risks. If Moscow tightened terms, or if Western secondary sanctions grew harsher, India's energy security could be jeopardized. Diversification toward Middle Eastern and American suppliers was underway, but again, not fast enough to replace Russia overnight. Modi's Moscow visit therefore symbolized both continuity and caution. The handshakes and warm words reassured Moscow that India was not turning its back. The carefully voiced criticism signaled to Washington that India was not blind to the human toll of the war. It was a balancing act broadcast on the global stage. The domestic reception reflected the divide. In India, many praised Modi for maintaining independence and refusing to be bullied by Western pressure. Commentators framed the visit as a masterstroke of diplomacy, showing that India could engage with all sides on its own terms. In the West, however, opinion was less forgiving. Editorials criticized India for hugging Putin while Ukraine bleeds, warning that New Delhi risked tarnishing its reputation as a democratic leader. For Russia, the optics were invaluable. At a time when it faced isolation from the West, the sight of Modi in Moscow sent a message that Moscow was not alone. India's presence lent legitimacy, bolstered confidence, and demonstrated that sanctions had not severed all bridges. For Putin, the embrace was more than symbolic. It was a lifeline, a reminder that great powers still courted Russia's partnership. For Washington, the visit was a reminder of the limits of influence. No matter how much pressure it applied, India would not cut off Russia entirely. The U.S. had to accept that strategic autonomy meant New Delhi would pursue multiple alignments at once, even when they conflicted with American priorities. The challenge was to find ways to cooperate without demanding complete conformity. The Russia-India balancing act, embodied in that Moscow visit, is likely to endure. It reflects not just a moment, but a structural reality. India cannot afford to abandon Russia, and Russia cannot afford to lose India. Yet India also cannot afford to lose America. Navigating this triangle will define much of its foreign policy in the years ahead. The images from Moscow in July 2024 captured the essence of this dilemma: smiles and embraces in one moment, subtle rebukes in the next. A leader walking a tightrope, knowing that any misstep could cost his country dearly. It was not just diplomacy, it was survival in a world where alliances are fragile, interests are paramount, and morality is often filtered through the lens of necessity. Snow sweeps across the jagged peaks of the Himalayas, where the air is thin and the silence is broken only by the crunch of boots on ice. But in these frozen highlands, silence is deceptive. Thousands of soldiers stand watch on both sides of a disputed frontier, weapons at the ready, each patrol step a reminder of a rivalry stretching back decades. The line of actual control, the fragile boundary separating India and China, has long been a zone of tension, but since the deadly Galwan Valley clash of 2020, it has become one of the most militarized places on Earth. Dozens of Indian and Chinese soldiers died that night, fighting with stones, sticks, and makeshift weapons in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The memory of that confrontation lingers, casting a permanent shadow over relations between the two Asian giants. By 2025, the border remains tense. Infrastructure projects, surveillance drones, and fortified outposts have multiplied. Each side accuses the other of creeping advances, roads built a few kilometers too far, encampments set up in disputed valleys. The risk of escalation is constant. For India, these standoffs are more than territorial disputes. They are daily reminders that China is both its largest neighbor and its most formidable rival. China looms over India's foreign policy like an ever-present storm. Economically, it is the world's manufacturing powerhouse. Militarily, it is far stronger, boasting advanced technologies and a defense budget that dwarfs India's. Strategically, it maintains close ties with Pakistan, India's traditional adversary, creating the nightmare scenario of a two-front conflict. This is where the United States comes into play. For Washington, China is the pacing threat, the competitor that defines American strategy in the Indo-Pacific. For New Delhi, China is the neighbor that must be confronted every day across icy passes and contested valleys. The shared perception of Beijing as a challenge has brought India and America closer in recent years. Defense cooperation has deepened through intelligence sharing, joint exercises, and high-tech arms sales. Agreements like BICA and COMCASA, which allow the exchange of sensitive military data and logistics, symbolize this strategic convergence. Yet China's presence also complicates India's ties with Russia. Moscow and Beijing, once uneasy partners, now speak with near unanimity in international forums. Their no limits of partnership challenges the U.S.-led order, and while Moscow still values India, its reliance on Beijing has never been greater. This places New Delhi in an awkward position. Maintaining ties with Russia means, indirectly, dealing with a Russia increasingly aligned with its greatest adversary. The border tensions are not just military, they have seeped into the economic and political fabric of India. Chinese apps have been banned, investments scrutinized, and public sentiment hardened. For many Indians, the dragon is no longer just a competitor, but a threat to sovereignty and national pride. Each clash in the Himalayas strengthens calls to reduce dependence on Chinese imports, even if the economic cost is steep. On the ground, soldiers live a different reality. Indian troops in Ladakh endure bitter winters at altitudes of 14,000 feet, rotating in and out of forward positions where oxygen is scarce and frostbite is common. Chinese forces, backed by advanced logistics and infrastructure, mirror their every move. Patrols sometimes come face to face, staring across narrow ridges, each side unwilling to retreat. The potential for another flare-up remains high, and even a small miscalculation could spiral into a major conflict. For Beijing, these confrontations serve multiple purposes. They test India's resolve, signal China's dominance, and remind New Delhi of its vulnerabilities. For India, resisting Chinese advances is about more than territory. It is about asserting sovereignty, showing strength, and signaling to allies and rivals alike that it will not be pushed aside. The shadow of China also shapes India's calculations with the United States. Closer ties with Washington enhance India's leverage, but they also invite criticism from Beijing, which sees the Indo-US partnership as containment. When India participates in the Quad, alongside the U.S., Japan, and Australia. China frames it as part of an American strategy to encircle it. For New Delhi, the challenge is balancing deterrence with restraint, ensuring that cooperation with Washington strengthens its hand without making it appear like a pawn in America's great power rivalry. The Himalayan frontier, in this way, is more than just a border dispute. It is the physical manifestation of a larger strategic struggle. Each new road, each new outpost, each new skirmish reflects the wider contest for influence, security, and prestige in Asia. And in this contest, India cannot ignore China, cannot escape its geography, and cannot afford to miscalculate. As winter winds sweep across the mountains, both sides dig in deeper. The standoff continues, shaping policies in New Delhi, Washington, and Beijing alike. The shadow of China stretches far beyond the snow line, influencing trade, diplomacy, and alliances. For India, the dragon at the gate is both an immediate danger and the backdrop against which every other foreign policy choice must be made. The Indo-Pacific has become the stage for the world's most decisive strategic drama. Stretching from the waters of the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, this region holds the busiest shipping lanes, the fastest growing economies, and the fiercest rivalries of the 21st century. For Washington, this is where the contest with China will be won or lost. For India, this is the neighborhood it must navigate every day, balancing opportunity and danger with each decision. In recent years, India's partnership with the United States and its allies, Japan and Australia, has taken form in the Quad, an informal security dialogue that Beijing dismisses as an Asian NATO. To New Delhi, the Quad has symbolized a new sense of belonging among the world's democracies. Joint naval drills in the Bay of Bengal, technology sharing agreements, and supply chain initiatives all signal a common purpose: keeping the Indo-Pacific free, open, and resistant to authoritarian pressure. But as the U.S.-India trade dispute deepens and accusations over Russian oil and espionage swirl, the Quad itself feels the strain. For American policymakers, it is increasingly difficult to square punitive tariffs against a supposed partner with the rhetoric of strategic alignment. For Indian leaders, the contradiction is even sharper. How can the same Washington that calls New Delhi a pillar of stability also treat it as a violator of sanctions and a target of economic punishment? Inside India's foreign ministry, the mood has grown cautious. Officials quietly acknowledge that the Quad is valuable but not invulnerable. They point to a history of false starts. The grouping was first attempted in 2007, only to dissolve under pressure from Beijing and hesitation in Canberra. Its revival in the late 2010s has been stronger, but India remembers how fragile such alignments can be when interests diverge. The Indo-Pacific strategy rests on trust, and that trust is being tested. At stake is not only military cooperation, but also technological and economic resilience. The Quad's supply chain initiatives were meant to reduce dependence on China, especially in critical sectors like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. Yet if the United States is willing to weaponize tariffs against India, what confidence can New Delhi have in long-term stability? What assurances do Indian companies have that their goods will flow freely to Western markets without political strings attached? For China, the cracks in the Quad are an opportunity. Beijing has long argued that India is the weakest link in the chain, that its historical ties to Russia, its non-aligned traditions, and its fierce protection of sovereignty make it an unreliable partner for Washington. Every tariff, every diplomatic spat, every accusation of espionage serves as proof for Chinese strategists that the Quad is brittle, that India cannot be fully integrated into the American orbit. On the naval front, however, cooperation continues. The Malabar exercises, involving the four navies, still showcase interoperability. Indian and American warships sail side by side, practicing maneuvers designed to counter submarine threats and secure choke points like the Malacca Strait. Yet beneath the surface, doubts linger. Can India rely on America when Washington might suddenly turn punitive? Can America trust India when New Delhi still buys Russian arms and energy? This uncertainty reverberates in smaller Indo-Pacific nations too. Countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines watch closely. They see India as a potential counterweight to China, but they also see a partner entangled in disputes with its supposed allies. If New Delhi and Washington cannot maintain consistency, regional states may hedge their bets, turning back toward Beijing's economic embrace. At the heart of the issue lies a paradox. India and America share a vision of a free Indo-Pacific, but they differ on the methods and the compromises required. For Washington, isolating Russia is paramount, even if it means clashing with India. For New Delhi, balancing great powers is the only way to maintain sovereignty in a dangerous neighborhood. These competing instincts strain the Quad's cohesion. Still, there are areas of resilience. Technology cooperation, particularly in space and cyber defense, continues to expand. Both nations recognize the threat of Chinese dominance in critical infrastructure, from undersea cables to 5G networks. Joint research labs and student exchanges quietly sustain the connective tissue of the partnership, even as the headlines focus on conflict. But the fragility cannot be ignored. The Indo-Pacific strategy, once hailed as the defining blueprint of the century, now risks being undermined by contradictions. The Quad's future depends not only on managing external threats, but also on repairing internal rifts. Without trust between Washington and New Delhi, the vision of a strong Indo-Pacific alliance may remain an aspiration rather than a reality. As Chinese warships expand their reach in the South China Sea and Russian oil tankers continue to find buyers, the urgency of coordination grows. Yet in New Delhi and Washington, the question is no longer whether the Quad can counter authoritarian influence, but whether its own members can overcome mistrust long enough to make it work. The Indo-Pacific, vast and contested, waits for an answer.